Subscribe to Storylab. Now, let's begin this one. Marshall Douglas ran 5 miles every morning before dawn, a habit carved into him from 2 decades of military service. The Virginia woods behind his property were silent except for his controlled breathing and the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath his feet. At 42, his body remained a weapon, lean, scarred, and maintained with the precision of a man who understood that survival depended on discipline. Most people in the suburban neighborhood knew him as a fitness instructor who kept odd hours. They didn't know about the windowless facility 30 miles away, where he taught hand-to-hand combat to operators who didn't officially exist. His daughter Hannah was waiting on the porch when he returned, already dressed for school in jeans and a hoodie that concealed the compact frame she'd inherited from her late mother. At 14, she had Allison's green eyes and sharp cheekbones, but Marshall's quiet intensity. She sat cross-legged, reading a book on Brazilian jiu-jitsu he'd given her for her birthday. Chapter 12 yet? Marshall asked, toweling sweat from his neck. Twice. Hannah closed the book. The armbar variation doesn't work if they're bigger. I tested it. On who? Eric Harris. He's in my chemistry class. Volunteers at the boxing gym on weekends. She shrugged. He didn't mind. Marshall smiled despite himself. After Allison died from cancer 3 years ago, he poured everything into Hannah. Not just combat training, but philosophy, ethics, the difference between violence and self-defense. She absorbed it like a sponge, though sometimes her clinical approach to fighting worried him. She was too young to be this comfortable discussing joint locks. Homework done. Physics, English, and calculus. History test next week, already studied. She stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. Dad, there's this kid at school. Chester Cherry. He's been following Molly Romero around, cornering her after classes. Won't take no for an answer. Marshall's expression didn't change, but Hannah knew that stillness. You talked to her about it? She's scared. His dad's some big shot. Chester says he could do whatever he wants. Has he touched her? Not yet, but he's getting bolder. Hannah met his eyes. I told Molly she should tell someone. She won't. Then you stay out of it, Marshall said quietly. You help if she asks. Otherwise, you observe and document. Date, time, witnesses. You understand. Hannah nodded, but Marshall caught the flash of frustration in her face. She had her mother's fierce, protective instinct. It was one of the things he loved most about her, and one of the things that scared him. They drove to school in comfortable silence, the radio playing classic rock at low volume. Marshall dropped her at the front entrance of Riverside High, watching until she disappeared into the crowd of students. Then he made the 40-minute drive to the facility, thinking about Chester Cherry and wondering if he'd need to have a quiet conversation with the boy's father. The facility was disguised as a logistics warehouse, complete with loading docks and freight schedules that existed only on paper. Marshall parked in his usual spot and descended 3 levels underground to the training complex. His first class was at 0800, 6 operators from DevGru running through knife defense scenarios. They were good, fast, aggressive, well-trained. Marshall spent 2 hours breaking down their bad habits and rebuilding muscle memory. During his lunch break, Marshall sat in his small office reviewing contract paperwork when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Riverside High School. Mr. Douglas? This is Principal Sherry Rollins. I need you to come in immediately. There's been an incident involving Hannah. Marshall's pulse didn't quicken, but his mind shifted into tactical mode. What kind of incident? I prefer to discuss this in person. How soon can you be here? 30 minutes. He made it in 25, entering the school's administrative office with the same controlled calm he brought to hostage negotiations. Principal Rollins was a thin woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the exhausted expression of someone who'd spent too many years managing teenage chaos. She sat behind her desk flanked by 2 other people, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit who radiated smug authority, and a boy around Hannah's age with a cast on his right arm and a face that couldn't decide between pain and triumph. Hannah sat in a chair against the wall, her expression neutral, but Marshall knew his daughter. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands rested loosely on her thighs, ready to move. She'd been in a fight. Mr. Douglas, Principal Rollins began, Your daughter broke Chester Cherry's arm during school hours. The injury required emergency room treatment and will need surgery to properly set the bone. Marshall looked at Hannah. Why? He cornered me in the bathroom hallway during lunch, Hannah said calmly. Put his hand on my chest and said if I didn't go out with him, he'd tell everyone I begged for it anyway. When I told him to back off, he grabbed my wrist and pushed me against the wall. The man in the suit leaned forward. That's a lie. My son was simply talking to her when she attacked him without provocation. There are witnesses. Ooh, Marshall asked. That's not your concern, the man said. I'm Police Chief Kurt McKinney, and I'm trying to decide whether to have your daughter arrested for assault or allow the school to handle this internally with expulsion. Marshall studied McKinney for 3 seconds. The man's manicured hands, the Rolex that cost more than a chief's annual salary, the barely concealed contempt in his eyes. Marshall had met men like this before, bullies who'd climbed far enough up the ladder to believe they were untouchable. Hannah, Marshall said quietly, did you break his arm? Yes. Could you have gotten away without breaking it? Hannah paused, actually considering the question. Probably, but he's done this to other girls. I wanted to make sure he understood that actions have consequences. Chester McKinney started to speak, but his father silenced him with a gesture. Your daughter is violent and unstable, Kurt McKinney said. She's dangerous. I'm offering you a chance to make this right before I involve the criminal justice system. What do you want? Principal Rollins asked weakly. Marshall could tell she was terrified of McKinney. An apology, Kurt said, looking directly at Marshall. Your daughter will apologize to my son publicly in front of the student body. And then she'll get down on her knees and lick his shoe clean as penance for what she's done. The silence that followed was absolute. Marshall didn't move, didn't blink. He simply looked at Kurt McKinney the way he'd looked at enemy combatants in Fallujah, like a problem to be solved. No, Marshall said. Kurt's face reddened. Excuse me. My daughter defended herself against sexual assault. She showed remarkable restraint. I would have done considerably more damage. So no, she won't apologize. And if you want to press charges, you should know that I'll be filing a counter-complaint for sexual assault and intimidation. I'll also be very interested to learn how a police chief affords a $20,000 watch on a public servant salary. Kurt McKinney stood slowly. You're making a mistake. I've made plenty, Marshall said. This isn't one of them. Get out of my office, Principal Rollins whispered. She wasn't talking to the McKinneys. Marshall and Hannah drove home in silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Hannah finally spoke. I'm sorry I got expelled. You're not expelled yet, Marshall said. But even if you are, you did the right thing. How's your hand? Hannah flexed her fingers. Sore. I should have used an open palm strike instead of a closed fist. Better force distribution. Marshall felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Inside, we need to talk about what happens next. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Allison had taught Hannah to read, where they'd celebrated birthdays and mourned losses. Marshall poured himself coffee and Hannah a glass of water. That man is dangerous, Marshall said. Not because he's a police chief. Because he's arrogant enough to believe he can do whatever he wants without consequences. Men like that don't back down. They escalate. I can handle myself. I know you can. But this isn't about individual capability. This is about power structures and corruption. Marshall leaned back in his chair. I'm going to make some calls. Find out exactly who Kurt McKinney is and what he's hiding. Because men who demand teenage girls lick their son's shoes are hiding something dark. Hannah nodded. What should I do? Stay alert. Vary your routes. If you see any of McKinney's people following you, you call me immediately. And Hannah, he waited until she met his eyes. If this goes bad, I need you to trust that I have a plan. Can you do that? Always, she said. That night, after Hannah went to bed, Marshall sat in his home office and started making calls. First to Leon Stewart, a former Delta operator who now worked private intelligence. Then to Vincent Robbins, who'd left the DEA after discovering he had more tolerance for moral ambiguity than bureaucratic oversight. Finally to Darren Montgomery, an FBI agent who owed Marshall his life from an operation in Yemen that had never made any official reports. By 3 in the morning, Marshall had assembled a profile of Kurt McKinney that made his jaw tighten. The police chief had been under investigation twice for civil rights violations, both cases quietly buried. His department had the highest rate of evidence tampering in the state. Witnesses in cases against McKinney's friends had a habit of recanting or disappearing, and the chief's financial records showed deposits that suggested either spectacular investment luck or payments from sources that preferred to remain anonymous. But what interested Marshall most were the names of 12 men, ranging from enforcers to ex-cons, who'd all received favorable treatment from McKinney's department despite serious criminal records. Men who showed up on surveillance photos outside businesses that refused to pay protection money. Men who made problems disappear. Marshall leaned back in his chair, staring at the photos on his screen. Kurt McKinney wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was running a criminal enterprise under the cover of his badge, and his spoiled son was used to getting everything he wanted because Daddy had the muscle to make it happen. The principal had called it an incident, but Marshall recognized it for what it really was, a declaration of war from a man who'd never met someone unwilling to bend. Marshall began planning. 3 days later, Principal Rollins called again. Hannah was officially expelled, effective immediately. The school board had voted unanimously after a thorough investigation that somehow involved no interviews with Hannah or the other girls Chester had harassed. Marshall had expected this. He'd already enrolled Hannah in an online academy that would let her complete high school at her own pace. What he hadn't expected was the police cruiser that started parking across from his house every night, or the citations he received for traffic violations he hadn't committed, or the health inspector who showed up claiming anonymous complaints about his property. The message was clear: submit or be crushed under the weight of institutional power. Marshall ignored it all, continuing his investigation and preparing for the inevitable escalation. Hannah seemed almost excited, which worried him until he realized she'd figured out what he was doing. She'd found his research on McKinney, and instead of being scared, she'd started adding to it, compiling testimonies from girls at school who'd been harassed by Chester, documenting the officers who turned blind eyes. "You're not going to back down, are you?" she said one evening, standing in the doorway of his office. "No." "Good." Neither would Mom. 2 weeks after the incident, on a Friday evening when the autumn sun hung low over the Virginia hills, Marshall was in his garage working on his truck when 3 black SUVs pulled into his driveway. He didn't stop what he was doing, just continued torquing the bolt he'd been adjusting while counting the men who emerged from the vehicles. 12, as expected, all wearing civilian clothes, all moving with the coordinated purpose of men who'd worked together before. And at the center, Kurt McKinney in another expensive suit, looking like a man who'd come to deliver a lesson. Marshall set down his wrench and walked to the garage entrance, wiping his hands on a rag. Behind him, through the door connecting to the house, he heard Hannah's footsteps. She appeared at his shoulder, took one look at the assembled men, and smiled. That smile was all Allison, fierce and knowing and absolutely unafraid. "Mr. Douglas," Kurt McKinney said, his voice carrying across the driveway. "I gave you a chance to make this right. You refused. So now we're going to have a different conversation." Marshall saw the bulges of concealed weapons on at least 8 of the men. He saw the way they positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. He saw the confidence in McKinney's face, the absolute certainty that he'd brought overwhelming force to crush a single man and his daughter. "You brought 12 armed men to threaten a 14-year-old girl," Marshall said calmly. "That tells me everything I need to know about you." "This doesn't have to be ugly," McKinney said. "Your daughter apologizes, humiliates herself in front of my son, and you both leave town. Start over somewhere else. Or we make an example of you that everyone in this county will remember." "That's quite a speech," Marshall said. "Did you practice it?" One of the men, a thick-necked enforcer with prison tattoos creeping up his collar, started forward. "You want us to teach him respect, boss?" McKinney raised a hand, stopping him. "Not yet. Give him one more chance to be smart." Marshall glanced at Hannah. Her smile had widened slightly, and he realized she'd noticed what he had. The placement of the SUVs, the way the men had clustered together, the complete lack of tactical discipline. These weren't operators. They were street thugs used to intimidating civilians who couldn't fight back. They had no idea what they'd walked into. "Hannah," Marshall said quietly. "Go inside. Kitchen table. You know what to do." "Yes, sir." She disappeared into the house, and Marshall heard the lock click behind her. Kurt McKinney laughed. "Sending your daughter away? Smart. She doesn't need to see what happens next." Marshall stepped out of the garage, moving into the driveway with a fading sunlight cast long shadows across the concrete. He studied each man carefully, categorizing threats and vulnerabilities. The two on the left were carrying probably 9mm. The big one with the tattoos had a knife, visible through the outline of his jacket. The others were varying degrees of armed and dangerous, but sloppy, overconfident. "Before this goes any further," Marshall said, "I want you to understand something. I train people to kill efficiently and survive impossible situations. I've done it for 20 years in places you couldn't find on a map. You brought 12 criminals with guns to my home because you think numbers and weapons equal victory. Is there a point to this?" McKinney asked. "Yes. I'm giving you one chance to leave. Get in your vehicles, drive away, and accept that you can intimidate everyone. Because if you stay, what happens next is on you." The men exchanged glances. A few smirked. McKinney's face hardened. "You think you're special because you served? I've buried better men than you. Boys." He snapped his fingers. "Teach him some manners. Break his legs. Let him crawl inside to his daughter." The 12 men moved forward as one, and Marshall's world narrowed to pure tactical calculation. He'd spent the last 2 weeks preparing for exactly this scenario, and as the first man reached for him, Marshall Douglas went to work. The opening move was simple, a redirect to the reaching arm combined with a palm strike to the throat that dropped the first attacker gasping. Marshall flowed into the second man, using the falling body as a shield while delivering a devastating knee strike to the liver. 2 down in 3 seconds. The big one with the tattoos pulled his knife, slashing in a wide arc that showed more bravado than skill. Marshall caught the wrist, broke it with a practiced twist, and used the man's own momentum to drive the knife into the thigh of the attacker, coming from his right. 3 down. A gunshot cracked through the air. One of the armed men had panicked and fired. The bullet went wide, shattering a window on Marshall's truck. But the shot gave him the confirmation he needed. They were willing to use lethal force, which meant he was legally justified in responding in kind. Marshall moved like water through the chaos, each strike precise and devastating. He'd spent 2 decades teaching operators to fight multiple opponents, to use environment and psychology as weapons. These men had numbers, but Marshall had expertise honed in rooms where mistakes meant death. A tire iron swung at his head. He ducked under it, drove his elbow into the attacker's temple, and appropriated the weapon for himself. The iron bar became an extension of his will, breaking the knee of one man, disarming another, creating space and havoc. But Marshall had also prepared something these men couldn't anticipate. As he fought, the motion-activated sprinkler system he'd modified activated, but instead of water, it released a concentrated irritant, a custom mixture he'd developed in his facility that was legal for training purposes but devastatingly effective in enclosed spaces. The driveway filled with a fine mist that burned eyes and respiratory systems without causing permanent damage. The attackers began choking, their coordination falling apart as they stumbled and clawed at their faces. Marshall had taken a preventative dose of antihistamine and wore contact lenses that protected his eyes. He pressed the advantage ruthlessly, methodical violence that left men groaning on his driveway in various states of incapacitation. Kurt McKinney stumbled backward toward his SUV, eyes streaming, finally understanding that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. But Marshall was already there, moving through the chemical fog like a ghost, yanking the police chief away from his vehicle and slamming him face first onto the hood. "You made a mistake," Marshall said quietly, cinching McKinney's arms behind his back with a zip tie he'd palmed from his pocket. "You thought intimidation and violence were your personal tools. But I've lived in those worlds longer than you've had a badge." Around them, the 12 men were neutralized, unconscious, wounded, or fleeing. Marshall had designed the entire scenario to be survived but not forgotten. Every injury was painful, but recoverable. Every humiliation was earned. Through the kitchen window, he could see Hannah sitting at the table with her phone, calmly recording everything. The smile had never left her face. Marshall cable-tied McKinney's ankles and left him on the driveway, then pulled out his own phone and made a call. "Darren? It's Marshall. I'm going to need federal officers at my residence." "Yes, now. I've just defended myself and my daughter against an armed assault led by Police Chief Kurt McKinney. You might want to bring forensics. I think you'll find some interesting things in his vehicles." He hung up and walked back into his house, leaving McKinney screaming threats into the Virginia twilight. Hannah looked up from her phone. All recorded. Multiple angles. Cloud backup already uploaded. "Good girl," Marshall said, pulling 2 bottles of water from the fridge. "FBI's on the way. We're going to have a long night of statements and questions." "Dad." Hannah's smile had faded, replaced by something more serious. "Those men, you could have killed them." "Yes, but you didn't, because death is easy. I wanted them to remember this, to understand that actions have consequences." He sat across from her. "Violence is a tool, Hannah. Powerful but dangerous. Tonight, I used it to protect us and to send a message. But it's not the end of this. It's the beginning. What happens now? Now we watch Kurt McKinney's empire collapse under the weight of its own corruption." The FBI arrived 20 minutes later. 3 vehicles carrying agents who treated the scene with the gravity it deserved. Darren Montgomery led the team, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the aftermath, wounded men being treated by paramedics, weapons being cataloged, McKinney still zip-tied on the driveway, and shook his head. "Marshall, you know I can't just make this disappear. I'm not asking you to. I defended my home against an armed assault. Hannah has video evidence. I have recordings of McKinney's threats. And if you search those vehicles, I'm betting you'll find enough to connect him to about a dozen unsolved crimes." Darren studied him for a long moment. "You planned this. I prepared for this. There's a difference." "Is there?" But Darren was already gesturing to his team. "Search the vehicles. Document everything. And someone get that phone footage from the daughter properly with consent forms." The search of McKinney's SUVs yielded a treasure trove: unregistered weapons, falsified evidence bags, and, most damning, a ledger hidden in the center console that detailed protection payments from local businesses. It was sloppy, arrogant record-keeping from a man who'd never expected to be caught. By midnight, Kurt McKinney was in federal custody, screaming about rights and lawyers and political connections that were already abandoning him. His 12 men were in various hospitals and jails, their own criminal records ensuring they'd face serious charges for the assault. Marshall gave his statement with calm precision, laying out the timeline: the school incident, the intimidation, the escalating threats, and finally the armed assault on his property. Hannah's video corroborated everything, showing 12 armed men advancing on a single father defending his home. "You know this isn't over," Darren said quietly as the last ambulance pulled away. "McKinney has friends, people who will want revenge. Let them come," Marshall said. "I've got more plans." Hannah had fallen asleep on the couch, still clutching her phone. Marshall covered her with a blanket and stood watching the investigators work through his property, documenting the scene that would become evidence in what newspapers would later call the McKinney conspiracy. The next morning, Marshall woke to find his driveway cleaned and repaired by an FBI forensics team that had worked through the night. Hannah was already up, reading the news on her tablet. "It's everywhere," she said, showing him headlines. "Police chief arrested in armed assault. Federal investigation into corruption. They're already finding more bribes, evidence tampering, connections to organized crime." Marshall made breakfast while monitoring secure channels that were lighting up with information about McKinney's network. The man had been stupid enough to keep records, and those records were unraveling years of corruption. Businesses came forward with evidence of extortion. Women reported assaults that had been buried. Officers in McKinney's department began cooperating to save themselves. It was exactly what Marshall had anticipated. Corrupt systems collapse quickly once the keystone is removed, and Kurt McKinney had been that keystone, arrogant enough to believe himself invincible sloppy enough to leave trails. But Marshall wasn't satisfied. McKinney would face federal charges, certainly. He'd probably serve time. But the man's son, Chester, was still out there, still protected by money and connections, still harassing girls who couldn't fight back. That needed to be addressed. Marshall spent the next week working with Darren Montgomery's team, providing evidence and testimony that built an airtight case against McKinney. The police chief's assets were frozen, his bail denied due to flight risk. His political allies vanished like smoke, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Hannah returned to her online classes, excelling as always. But Marshall noticed her watching the news coverage with an intensity that suggested unfinished business. She'd been the catalyst for all of this. Her refusal to be victimized had exposed an entire criminal enterprise. But Chester McKinney was still walking free, his broken arm healed, his attitude unchanged. "I've been thinking," Hannah said one evening, "about Chester. His dad's going to prison, but Chester's just going to blame me for ruining his life. He's not going to learn anything." "What would you have him learn?" Marshall asked. "That he's not special. That being rich and connected doesn't make you immune to consequences. That the world isn't going to bend to him because he throws tantrums." She looked at her father. "You taught me that violence is a tool. But you also taught me that sometimes the best victories don't involve fighting at all." Marshall smiled. "What did you have in mind?" Hannah pulled out her tablet, showing him a file she'd been compiling. Every girl Chester had harassed, every incident documented with dates and testimonies. She'd reached out to them through social media, built a network of witnesses who'd been silent because they thought no one would believe them. "I want to file a class action lawsuit," Hannah said. "Civil case, Chester and his father as defendants. Use their own money to compensate the victims. Make it public enough that Chester can't just transfer schools and start over. Let him carry the weight of what he's done." "That's ambitious," Marshall said. "And expensive. Not if we have a right lawyer. Someone who'd take the case for the publicity and the principle." She showed him another file. Vincent Robbins' sister, Rachel Robbins, an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases and had a reputation for taking down powerful defendants. Marshall reviewed the documents, impressed by Hannah's thoroughness. "You put this together yourself. You taught me to plan ahead, to understand that the best fights are won before the first punch is thrown." She met his eyes. "Chester McKinney needs to understand that he destroyed his own life. Not me, not you. Him. His choices, his actions, his consequences." Marshall made the call. Rachel Robbins agreed to take the case after reviewing Hannah's documentation. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. 12 plaintiffs ranging from age 13 to 17, all students at Riverside High, all with detailed accounts of harassment and assault by Chester McKinney. The civil case named both Chester and Kurt McKinney as defendants, alleging a pattern of behavior enabled by the father's abuse of authority. The media coverage was intense. Chester's face, smug and entitled in his school photos, became a symbol of privilege and predation. The lawsuit couldn't put him in jail, but it destroyed his reputation completely. Private schools rejected his applications. Universities rescinded early acceptance letters. His social media accounts became battlegrounds where former friends abandoned him to avoid association. Kurt McKinney, watching from his federal holding cell, saw his son's life disintegrate and understood the true scope of what Marshall Douglas had done. This wasn't just about defense or justice. This was about systematic dismantling of everything McKinney had built, using his own methods against him. The trial was held 6 months later, a media spectacle that drew national attention. Marshall sat in the gallery with Hannah, watching as 12 young women testified about their experiences. They spoke with courage and clarity, their testimonies building a portrait of systematic harassment enabled by institutional corruption. Chester McKinney took the stand in his own defense, but his attorney had given him the worst advice possible, claimed that the girls had wanted his attention, that they'd been flattered until Hannah Douglas had poisoned them against him. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and returned a verdict that awarded each plaintiff substantial damages. The combined total exceeded $3 million. Most of Kurt McKinney's hidden assets, seized by federal authorities and now redistributed to his son's victims. Chester McKinney walked out of the courthouse to find his car vandalized and protesters holding signs with his name attached to the word predator. His mother had filed for divorce. His trust fund was gone. His future, once guaranteed by money and connections, had evaporated. Hannah watched him stumble through the crowd and felt no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that justice had been served. The federal case against Kurt McKinney concluded 8 months after the driveway assault. The former police chief pled guilty to racketeering, corruption, evidence tampering, and assault with a deadly weapon. His cooperation led to the arrest of 17 other individuals in his network, including 3 judges and 2 state legislators. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Marshall attended the sentencing with Hannah, listening as the judge detailed the scope of McKinney's crimes. The lives ruined, the justice perverted, the community traumatized. McKinney's lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on his years of public service, but the judge shut him down with a single sentence. Public service is a trust, not a license to prey on the vulnerable. As Marshals led Kurt McKinney away, he caught Marshall's eye across the courtroom. There was no rage anymore, no arrogance. Just the hollow understanding that he'd lost everything because he'd underestimated a man who understood violence better than he ever could. Hannah squeezed her father's hand. "Is it over?" "This part is," Marshall said. "But there'll always be another bully, another person who thinks power makes them untouchable. That's why you need to stay sharp, stay ready." "Will you keep training me?" "Until you're better than me," Marshall said. "Which, at the rate you're going, won't be long." They drove home through Virginia countryside, turned golden with autumn, the radio playing classic rock, the familiar rhythm of their life restored. Hannah had finished her high school requirements early and been accepted to 3 universities with full scholarships. She'd chosen one with a strong criminal justice program, determined to build a career prosecuting people like Kurt McKinney. Marshall had returned to his work at the facility, training operators who would deploy to places where the line between right and wrong blurred but never disappeared entirely. His reputation had grown. The instructor who'd taken down a corrupt police chief and his criminal enterprise using nothing but preparation and precision. But the moment Marshall treasured most came 3 weeks after McKinney's sentencing. Hannah had been invited back to Riverside High for an assembly about bullying and self-defense. The principal, a new one, hired after Sherry Rollins resigned in disgrace, had asked Hannah to speak about her experience. Marshall sat in the audience, watching his daughter address a packed auditorium of students who'd once thought her expulsion was justified. She spoke about fear and courage, about standing up for yourself and others, about understanding that true strength wasn't physical, but moral. "People told me I should have stayed quiet," Hannah said. "I should have accepted Chester McKinney's harassment because fighting back would only make things worse. But staying quiet doesn't protect you. It protects bullies. And when we protect bullies, we become complicit in their cruelty." She paused, her green eyes scanning the crowd. "My father taught me to fight, but he also taught me why we fight. Not for revenge or pride, but to protect people who can't protect themselves. To create space for justice when systems fail. To prove that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, is above consequences." The applause was thunderous. Marshall saw Molly Romero in the crowd, the girl Hannah had worried about months ago, standing and clapping with tears streaming down her face. He saw teachers nodding, administrators looking uncomfortable, students understanding perhaps for the first time that they had agency in their own lives. After the assembly, as they drove home, Hannah was quiet. Finally, she said, "Mom would have been proud." "She is," Marshall said. "Wherever she is, she's proud of you." "I know I am." "I was scared," Hannah admitted, "when those men showed up at our house with guns. I saw them through the window, and I was terrified. Fear is natural. It's what you do with it that matters. I knew you had a plan. I trusted you. That's why I smiled." She looked at him. "But what if you hadn't? What if they'd actually hurt you?" Marshall pulled into their driveway, repaired and peaceful now, no trace of the violence that had occurred there. "Then you would have called the authorities, given them evidence, and made sure justice was served. Because I trained you not just to fight, but to think, to plan, to win. Did we win? Hannah asked. McKinney's in prison. Chester's life is ruined, but there are other bullies, other corrupt cops, other systems that fail people. We won our battle, Marshall said, and we sent a message that'll ripple outward. Every person who heard about this case, who saw a father and daughter stand up to institutional corruption and survive, they learned something. They learned that power isn't absolute, that preparation and principle can overcome numbers and weapons, that a victory that multiplies. Hannah nodded slowly. Then we'll keep fighting when the next battle comes. When it comes, Marshall agreed. But until then, we train. We prepare. We live. They went inside together, father and daughter, warriors at rest, but never truly disarmed. The house still smelled like Allison's cooking. Marshall had kept her recipes, her habits, her love alive in the small rituals that made a house a home. Over dinner, they discussed Hannah's college plans, debated political philosophy, and argued about whether Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Krav Maga was more practical for women's self-defense. It was normal, domestic, peaceful. But in Marshall's office, the files remained. Contacts maintained, skills sharpened, readiness preserved. Because the world still held men like Kurt McKinney, and it always would. The price of safety was eternal vigilance, and Marshall Douglas had long ago accepted that price. Hannah understood it too. That was perhaps Marshall's greatest achievement. Not teaching his daughter to fight, but teaching her why fighting mattered. Not making her hard, but making her strong. Not preparing her for violence, but preparing her to choose when violence was necessary and when mercy was stronger. As the evening settled into comfortable routine, Marshall's phone buzzed with a message from Darren Montgomery, another corrupt sheriff in Georgia. Similar pattern to McKinney. Might need consulting. Interested? Marshall glanced at Hannah, who was absorbed in a textbook on criminal psychology. He typed back, "Send me the details. I'll review." Because justice was a muscle that atrophied without exercise, and Marshall Douglas intended to stay very fit. The sun set over Virginia, casting long shadows across the Douglas property. Inside, lights glowed warm against the gathering darkness. A father and daughter, bound by love and loss, and the shared understanding that sometimes the world needed people willing to stand in the gap between the vulnerable and the predators. Hannah had broken a boy's arm in self-defense. Kurt McKinney had tried to crush her for it. Instead, he discovered that some fathers train their daughters not just to survive, but to triumph. That some men build their lives around protecting others. And those men are very, very dangerous to bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. Marshall Douglas had shown mercy when 12 armed men came to his home. He could have killed them all and been legally justified. Instead, he disabled them, humiliated them, and used them as bait to catch the bigger predator controlling them. That was the lesson Kurt McKinney learned too late. The most dangerous men aren't the ones who resort to violence first, but the ones who understand violence so completely they can wield it with surgical precision. Hannah had learned it too, but she'd learned the fuller version. That true strength lay not in the capacity for violence, but in the wisdom to know when it was necessary and the courage to accept the consequences. The McKinney case became a textbook example in law enforcement ethics courses, a cautionary tale about corruption and institutional failure. But for those who knew the full story, it was something else, a reminder that every action creates ripples, every choice has consequences, and sometimes a single father protecting his daughter can bring down an empire. Marshall Douglas went to bed that night with the satisfaction of a job well done, but also the awareness that his work was never truly finished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to teach his daughter about courage and consequence. But tonight his home was safe. His daughter was proud. And somewhere in a federal prison, Kurt McKinney was learning the hardest lesson of his life. That when you come for a warrior's child, you'd better be prepared to lose everything. Hannah fell asleep reading about forensic psychology, dreaming of a future where she'd prosecute predators and protect the vulnerable. She'd learn from the best, a father who understood that the ultimate victory wasn't in defeating your enemies, but in making sure they could never hurt anyone again. The night settled over the Douglas home like a benediction, peaceful and earned. And when morning came, they would train again, prepare again, stand ready again. Because that's what warriors do. They protect, they prepare, they prevail, and they never, ever apologize for defending what matters. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.